I hope you had a good day. I'm not going to say much, I know everybody is tired. I just want to thank you again for all your time and efforts today. And it's my pleasure to have Professor Chiara de Cesari with us tonight to give the keynote speech. Professor de Cesari is the professor of Heritage and Memory at the University of Amsterdam. There is much to say about her profile, but I'll leave that to Dr. Nour to come and introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amal, and I'm sorry again for the long day, and I hope you still have some energy left, but let's wait until the glasses are changed so we can have full concentration. All right, so next to me, Professor Chiara de Cesari. Many of you have seen her before, read her work, or cited her in the dissertation or articles. Chiara de Cesari is the appointed Professor of Heritage and Memory and Chair of Global Cultural Studies at the University of Amsterdam, UVA. So just to distinguish that, we have in Amsterdam two universities, University of Amsterdam and Free University of Amsterdam. So she's from the University of Amsterdam only. Her wide-ranging research explores how forms of memory, heritage, art, and cultural politics are shifting under conditions of post-coloniality, transnationalism, and state transformation. She's particularly concerned with the ways in which colonial legacies live on today, especially in museums and cultural institutions. She's also committed to explore how combining heritage and memory work with the artistic research can further this research endeavor, as well as the undoing of colonial legacies. One strand of Chiara's work explores transnational politics of memory and cultural heritage, above all in Palestine, particularly in West Bank. Her monograph, Heritage and the Cultural Struggle for Palestine, published by Stanford University Press in 2019, argues that the Palestinian civil society has enrolled museums and urban regeneration initiatives to assert its distinct cultural heritage and build an alternative institutional infrastructure amid in the enduring Israeli occupation. Another research strand concerns colonial heritage and the relationship between memory and racism in contemporary Europe. Chiara is currently co-writing another book monograph, provisionally titled Curating the Colonial, which explores how museums are reframing colonial histories in response to post-colonial critiques in the context of the rising of the right-wing parties and ultra-nationalist populism in Europe. Still another strand examines how artists and activists are reclaiming and reinventing cultural institutions. On this theme, Chiara is leading a major project named Imagining Institutions Otherwise, funded by the Dutch National Research Council, Nederlands Wetenschap Onderzoek, NWO. Across these interests, Chiara has published many articles in journals such as American Anthropologist, Current Anthropology, and Memory Studies, and co-edited two key volumes in Memory Studies: European Memory in Populism, published by Routledge in 2019, Transnational Memory, published by De Gruyter 2014, and a special issue at the International Journal of Heritage Studies on Urban Heritage and Gentrification in 2018. Committed to international and interdisciplinary collaboration, she has been involved in several major international research projects. Currently, she's part of the HERA Encounter Points project, the Transatlantic Platform for Social Innovations, Worlding Public Cultures Network, and the Pressing Matter Ownership, Value, and the Question of Colonial Heritage in Museums, which is another project funded by the National Research Agency in the Netherlands, NWO. Chiara, the floor is yours. We are all looking forward for your talk, and many people actually texted me on social media waiting for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Nour. Thank you very much for this generous introduction and especially for this lovely invitation that has allowed me to come to Doha and to Qatar for the first time. I'm still exploring the country, and I want to thank not only you, Nour, but also Zinat and the Dean of Social Sciences, Dr. Hamal Al-Ghazal, and the entire staff that has allowed me to come here. And that has allowed me to, and will allow me to share with you the results of many years of research. Because in this talk, I will bring together two different strands of my research. I'm rather an eclectic researcher and have different strands, as Nour presented. But a lot of those research strands, in fact, are connected by an interest into question of colonial heritage, very broadly conceived and persisting, enduring in the present, and the question of the relationship between heritage, memory, and cultural production and state transformation. So the transformations of the institutions that we live in, from universities to museums and cultural institutions more broadly. And in this lecture, I will examine different facets of the crucial tangle of heritage, memory, and politics in the MENA region. Focus will be on one of my long-standing interests, that is the relationship between heritage and the role of heritage and memory in the making and unmaking of power and the state, as my title recites. Within this theme, today I will move from addressing the relationship between heritage and destruction to that of heritage and reconstruction, broadly and imaginatively conceived. The body of research on these topics indeed has grown exponentially in the last 2 decades, offering many original, compelling analyses, particularly in the MENA region. I will not have time to delve into an aspect that I wanted to include in my talk originally, which is the relationship between this amazing scholarship that is being produced and has been produced in the last 20 years about heritage, memory in the MENA region, and its relationship with so-called memory and heritage studies, which have constituted themselves into full-fledged academic fields in the last 20 years, but still remain largely Eurocentric, despite the intentions of the scholars involved. I think this is a question that we should ask ourselves about the kind of intervention, whether or not we want to make a specific intervention into these fields, which are garnering increasing space and positions in universities and institutions. And I feel that those are rather neglecting this amazing scholarship that is coming from and practice that is coming from the MENA region. But I won't have time to engage with these topics, but I hope perhaps we can have time at the end of my talk in the discussion to flesh out some of these issues. So what I will do in the next 45, 50 minutes, first, building on this amazing research as well as my own research, I will advance a twofold argument. First, I will argue that a rigorous historicized engagement with these topics must begin by unraveling the deep entanglement of heritage and archaeology with empire and state building, which has caused massive non-human and human destruction. In this context, I will analyze the infamous case of heritage destruction by Daesh, the Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria, to show how the legacy of colonialism has persisted in the region's post-colonial states, including Daesh, and especially in their ideology and use of heritage. Second, by elaborating on my own research in Palestine, I will explore how civil society may autonomously self-organize, even before a conflict is over, to implement form of heritage and culture-led reconstruction that foster societal resilience and even positive social change. So my question, my broader question that I will ask today is whether Palestine could serve as a model for post-conflict heritage reconstruction elsewhere. And indeed, I can anticipate my conclusion. I will argue that the work of Palestinian cultural and heritage organizations might point in very interesting direction. And just as a caveat at the beginning of my talk, when I say post-conflict or post-colonial, I usually and always, I would say in 99% of the cases, I mean post-conflict with a post in parentheses and post-colonial also with the post in parentheses. And here I build very much on the work of a scholar which has been very, very influential for my trajectory, who is Anne Stoller, who has also written about Palestine, particularly in relation to what she calls archives of the census. So I will move from talking about Daesh destruction and to what I call creative institutionalism. And for me, the most poignant image, representation of what I mean by creative institutionalism is this drawing by Hassan El-Urani, who a wonderful Palestinian artist, Allah yarhamu, who died in 2003, and left us with an amazing collection of drawings, in particular, which represents often Hassan flying on a bike over different cities. And I'm particularly attached to this drawing because it represents Hassan on his bike with flowers, flying over the old city of Hebron, where his family comes from. And for me, it's really a powerful symbol of how heritage, if creatively, imaginatively reconceived, can offer a way out and a very interesting set of tools to think about both sort of material and societal reconstruction. And this is why it's on the cover of my book, Heritage and the Cultural Struggle for Palestine, which is what the second part of my talk extensively draws upon.
Excuse me, what is the name of the artist again?
Hassan El-Urani. Hassan Urani. Yeah. He has also two brothers who are currently practicing artists. I was about to include also the work of his brother, Khaled Urani, in the second part of my talk, but I don't have time to do that. This is the Palestinian Art Academy, but we can talk about that also in the Q&A. So the unfolding of my talk today will reflect, in fact, the trajectory of my research on Palestinian and MENA heritage more broadly that resulted in this book that came out right after the COVID pandemic. Indeed, over the years, my research has shifted from focusing on violence, the relationship between heritage and conflict, and heritage and colonization, to focusing on issues of societal reconstruction through and beyond heritage, and particularly what I called creative institutionalism and the ways in which civil society actors can mobilize heritage as a site for political claim-making and alternative institution building in ways that open up to different futures. In other words, how heritage experiments in the MENA region and the Global South more broadly may offer the imaginative building blocks of future institutions. Now I make a major step back to kickstart the part of my talk on post-colonial ruins and heritage and destruction. I guess I don't have to introduce this infamous image is Palmyra being dynamited by Daesh militants. The spectacular, carefully choreographed and hyper-mediated acts of destruction at a number of world-famous archaeological sites by Daesh or Islamic State across Syria and Iraq in the mid-2010s made headlines around the world and still remain today a powerful symbol, a kind of visual shortcut for the group politics itself. The ancient cities of Palmyra, Nimrud, and Hatra, and the Mosul Museum, but also local shrines and saints' tombs, the heritage of popular religiosity and of Yazidi, Shia, and Christian communities, have all been the object of Daesh wrath. In the mainstream global media, these acts of destruction have largely been interpreted as an expression of Daesh barbaric iconoclasm and the fight against idolatry of its extremist brand of Salafism. I won't talk too much about that, but of course there is also the interpretation, particularly for what concerns the attacks against non-Sunni Islamic heritage and other religious sites, which has been interpreted as a form of cultural cleansing and as a way to annihilate the cultural diversity of the region. This interpretation has been mentioned in a number of papers that preceded my talk. I think I don't want to propose here one explanation for this deliberate heritage acts of heritage destruction, but suggest that there are aspects of ethnic cleansing, there are aspects of theology, but there is also a profoundly political dimension of Daesh deliberate targeting of heritage that has been largely neglected. Public reactions in those medias, the mainstream global medias, have often been couched in a civilizational language, representing the seeming war on the remains of the so-called cradle of civilization as the ultimate proof and symbols of Daesh barbarism and its repudiation of civilization itself. Instead, I offer here a different reading that highlights the long-standing link between archaeology and empire and state building in the MENA region. I argue that we cannot understand Daesh deliberate heritage destruction without unraveling Near Eastern archaeology deep entanglement with both the history of Western colonial and neo-colonial interventions in Iraq and Syria and beyond, and the political projects of the several anti-colonial nationalisms in the region that in some ways, including the cult and use of archaeology, reproduced the colonial legacy. And here for this, I build very much on the work of colleagues such as Elliot Kolla, but also Joseph Massad in relation to Egypt in particular. So I argue that in spite of the apparent radical break represented by Daesh deliberate targeting of heritage, there is a continuity running through the history of Iraq and Syria, although to a slightly lesser extent, in the political mobilization of antiquities, which have been used for the symbolic display and very enactment of state power long before 2014. So I've given this talk once in the Netherlands, and a few people have vehemently attacked me because they thought that my point was to explain or legitimize or excuse Daesh acts of destruction. Of course, I know I don't have to repeat this in front of such an audience, but just to be sure, this is not what I mean. What I'm saying is that those acts cannot be explained only in religious terms or in terms of cultural cleansing. They must be related to specific ways of instantiating, producing state powers that go back at least to the colonial period. So I want to place in the first part of my talk Daesh destruction within a specific political genealogy by showing you some examples. So for several scholars, Daesh treatment of art and heritage is a crucial piece of its recruitment and financing strategies. I quote Erin Thompson here. I push this argument further by suggesting that we also view this treatment as the hallucinated reversal of a certain power and state-building logics. So in other words, to fully grasp the politics at play in the dynamiting of the Palace Gate of Nimrud and the Arch of Triumph or the Bell Temple in Palmyra, we must juxtapose these images with the multiple ones produced, for example, by Saddam Hussein's obsession with ancient antiquities as props for his power. It is also useful, this is, for example, one example of Saddam Hussein placing himself within this sort of longue durée Mesopotamian lineage and lineage of Mesopotamian rulers. And these are the walls of Jerusalem. But it's also useful to recollect not only the looting of the Baghdad Museum, but especially the powerful images of American boots stationed in the middle of ancient Babylon, which the US military turned into the famous Camp Alpha or the ruins in 2003. What has been especially and spectacularly targeted for destruction are some of the most iconic sites of the narrative of the cradle of civilization and the symbols of ancient Mesopotamia dug up and reconstructed for over a century by both colonial and post-colonial archaeology. Palmyra, Nineveh, and the Lamassu, represented here, or huge statues of winged bulls and lions with human heads that used to guard the city and palace gates of ancient Assyria, icons of power past and present. Strikingly, Lamassu appeared on the logo of the US forces Iraq, the last military command to leave Iraq in 2011. Daesh iconoclasts, in other words, were targeting heritage also because the latter is a key site of national identity, which they fundamentally contested as a colonial invention in favor of a broader pan-Islamic or rather pan-Sunni community. Pushing this argument a little further, they targeted these prominent heritage sites as symbol of both colonial and post-colonial state powers. Many scholars have pointed in particular to the centrality of the reference to ancient Mesopotamia in the reproduction of Iraq Ba'athist regime and in promoting the cult of Saddam as the latest incarnation of a lineage of Mesopotamian heroes and kings. Now, I don't have too much time to go into the various, the famous projects for rewriting history of the 70s and 80s or Saddam's reconstruction of Babylon. But please see these coins, which shows very well how he placed himself within this lineage. A similar heritage politics, though much less extensive with little oil revenues, characterized Syria's Ba'ath too. Analyzing the crucial role of symbolic politics for Syria's Ba'ath, Lisa Wedin has contended that Syrian ideologues, and here I'm quoting Lisa Wedin, so Syrian ideologues use spectacles to revise resonant symbols so as to convey current political messages. Archaeology being such a symbol, a politics of symbolic reconstruction, in inverted commas, is arguably at work also in its destruction in Iraq and Syria. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a kind of a revisioning of power and the state through those symbolic remakings of heritage, be it either construction or destructions. And these bring together Saddam Hussein and Daesh iconoclasts, as well, arguably, as colonial archaeologists and agents. Now, I don't have to, in front of this audience, I don't have to talk extensively to explain the particular colonial origins of archaeology. I just wanted to show you probably one of the best example for me, which is the story of Gertrude Bell, who was, like many others, like, for example, Lawrence of Arabia, of Arabia, both in archaeologists and in colonial agents. And I think what's very paradigmatic about Gertrude Bell is that she set up the Baghdad museums. She created the infrastructure of antiquities in Iraq, and at the same time, she's considered the one who, or so the story goes, that drew the boundaries of modern Iraq. And so I want to emphasize here how, and here again, I'm building particularly on the work of people like Elliot Kolla and Joseph Massad, that while co-opted into elites, the post-colonial elites' cultural nationalism, and resignified as a means of national liberation and aggrandizement, the cult of antiquities and its dealing remain shaped by that colonial legacy. And this colonial legacy, I would argue, still imbues the infrastructure and some of the discourse of archaeology in the MENA region, and arguably we might have a debate in this regard, but this includes the very narratives of the cradle of civilization. I just want to make a mention. I have my own personal experience is in Syria. So I've worked a lot I've worked in Syria in the 90s, and then I moved to Palestine in the early 2000s. And I clearly remember how I participated in the making of the Raqqa Museum and the Deir ez-Zor Museum, and this is not something I'm particularly proud of. Also because I have seen with my own eyes not only the very close alliance of Western European archaeologists with the Assad regime, but also the ways in which these archaeological endeavors, this archaeological project have produced massive destruction, particularly for what concerned Islamic heritage, because everyone was interested in the pre-Islamic layers, and a lot of that was destroyed on the way to that. So, to conclude and summarize the first part of my talk, what I'm saying is that archaeological sites in the Levant are imbued with the co-presence, the oppressive co-presence of both colonial nationalism. And this must be taken into consideration when approaching such heritage. Why is it that we continue to talk about lack of trust between archaeologists and the so-called local communities? I believe this has to do with this very particular legacy. And so my argument further is that to understand heritage destruction, it is my argument, one must conceive the phenomenon in its plural complexity, illuminating how there are multiple forms of destruction, some less visible, but not less pernicious than others, and crucially, that destruction is profoundly entangled with reconstruction and what I have mentioned before as symbolic reconstruction of power. So one must view the heritage, so-called post-conflict reconstruction in the present, also through a historic lens, a longue durée lens, recognizing how heritage in the region cannot be disentangled from, again, both the enacting of state power and arguably also for its reimagining, which is what I'm going to talk in the second part of my, what I'm going to discuss in the second part of my talk. Before I move to the second part of my talk, I just want to mention someone who introduced me to Palestinian heritage and that I want to remember in this occasion. Adel Yahya, maybe some of you know him. Allah yarhamu, he died. He introduced me to Palestinian heritage in the early 2000s, and he was a very, very, very instrumental figure in the making of Palestinian heritage and in the NGOs that I will talk about in what follows. But we kept on having in our discussion a fundamental disagreement, because Adel was saying always we need to kind of depoliticize heritage and archaeology, because otherwise it's going to be destroyed, it's going to be razed to the ground. And my argument then as well as now is that you cannot separate clinically, like heritage and politics, archaeology and politics, and somehow we must deal with the politics together with the heritage. And this is not something we can set aside and believe this is the way to save and safeguard heritage. So now let's talk about reimagining the state more broadly, and cultural and heritage institutions in particular through heritage work in Palestine. So given this profound entanglement of heritage, colonialism, and oppressive nationalisms, and especially oppressive envisionings of the state, how to do heritage otherwise? Is it possible to reverse or change these pernicious uses of heritage? What role may a different politics of heritage play in the current context of expanding conditions of conflict, deprivation, and de-development in the region, of massive human and non-human destruction? With heritage, urban regeneration, and museum projects of widely different scales proliferating across the region, how can societies harness these developments to rethink and reimagine a more capacious heritage reconstruction? Might civil societies mobilize heritage as a tool to engender a measure of positive social change, even before a conflict is over? So in the second part of my talk, I will explore these questions by way of a set of examples relating to Palestine, and above all the West Bank, which has been the site of my research for many years, and which offers a paradigmatic case of enduring conflict and contested heritages. Many of you know, probably, the Palestinian Museum, might have been there. Many might not have been there because they cannot be there, but this is the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit. Heritage projects, and especially urban regeneration ones, as well as museums, have proliferated in recent years in the West Bank. There have been talks of a museum fever spreading across a landscape dot with, thankfully, not only Israeli settlements, but also beautiful old centers and historic villages being reconstructed. Most significantly, heritage has become an important language and tool for Palestinians to advance their rights to the land, and a way to intervene into the landscape to counter colonization. A quick example at the beginning of my discussion of Palestinian heritage organizations' work, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. This is the village of Beit Iksa, and close to Ramallah, and you see in the back, the red roofs is an Israeli colony. Now, this was Beit Iksa abandoned and left in ruins for a long time, and this is how it was restored by RIWAC, which is an organization that some of you might know, and that I will talk quite extensively in what comes next. And this is their restoration of the city of Beit Iksa, and here you can clearly see how, if you restore old buildings, old rundown buildings, and you bring people to live back there, then you physically stop the expansion of the settlements, because it becomes way more difficult, not impossible, of course, we know, and this past week has been a tremendous week in that regard, and others, but it becomes way more difficult for the settlers to come and occupy the Palestinian houses and Palestinian villages. So at the beginning of my research in Palestine, almost 20 years ago, I got struck by the cunning ways in which Palestinian heritage practitioners had turned a colonial practice upside down, reformulating it for new objectives. Now, I won't talk at all about the relationship and the use of the colonial use of heritage by the Israeli state. There is an amazing book by an old book, 2001, I believe, by Nadia Abou El-Haj, which talks about this topic, and I recommend everyone to read it if you haven't done yet. So at the beginning, I was very interested in exploring this relationship between heritage and conflict. But later, I realized the full extent to which Palestinian civil society work in heritage not only constitutes an effective means of resisting the Israeli colonization, but participate in a peculiar process of institution building, a kind of alternative state or parastate formation. My overall argument in what follows is that the West Bank is home to resourceful attempts to reverse colonial violence that trigger creative, if not always successful, experimentation with cultural and heritage instituting. By not successful, I refer to the fact of failures being a necessary and sometimes generative and productive aspect of this experimenting with cultural institutions. Created by the Oslo Accords in the 90s, the Palestinian Authority administers, the PA, administers territories relinquished by Israel. It was intended in the 90s to prepare for a future Palestinian state, but the collapse of the negotiations meant that such a state never really came to be. Of course, for many, this was already ingrained in the Oslo framework, but I will cut short on this political discussion. So the PA now is a non-sovereign body administering a series of fragmented Palestinian areas in the West Bank. For its critics, it acts as Israel watchdog by controlling and containing Palestinians, and as such plays a role in the maintenance of Israel's apartheid state. The PA then has essentially failed in its state-building project. But in the shadow of such PA's failure and the ongoing occupation and colonization by Israel, a process of ad hoc, informal institution building has unfolded in the cultural and other domains, driven by Palestinian NGOs and civil societies, entertaining a complex and in many ways ambivalent relationship with international donors. Over the past 2 decades, urban regeneration has proliferated in the broader MENA region and beyond. But Palestinian projects differ from equivalents in that they are less, in the wider region, in that they are less dominated by a commodified and commodifying logic, which foregrounds the promotion of tourism and economic gains for the few. So in Palestine, the main objective of urban regeneration is to stop the ongoing, unremitting erasure of the Palestinian historic landscape and facilitate Palestinian livelihoods. Under such circumstances, regeneration means saving a distinctively Palestinian-built environment from being drowned by the avalanche of concrete poured over it by Israeli settlements, as well as, of course, new Palestinian high-rise developments like Rawabi. For Palestinian NGOs in particular, it means regenerating both physical and social structure. So rebuilding heritage has to do also with rebuilding resilient communities that inhabit and give life to it. So I really oppose a strict distinction here and in general between intangible and tangible heritage that I think is extremely problematic. Now, something about the Palestinian Authority and its Department of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage. I might be criticized for my interpretation, but I would argue that together with the PA State Building Project, also the heritage project of the Palestinian Authority has essentially failed. Until 2008, there was no legislation protecting the historic heritage, historic built environment. And what was protected was only antiquities until 1700. So from 1994 until 2018, essentially, the Palestinian built environment, Palestinian historic environment, and vernacular architecture was not protected. And here, Palestinian NGOs like RIWAC stepped in outside of the existing legal framework to safeguard livelihoods along with heritage. Of course, traditional Palestinian architecture and symbolizes historic Palestine, which was lost in the 1948 Nakba, in which over 700 Palestinians were forced to leave what became the State of Israel, and over 400 Palestinian villages and towns were destroyed or depopulated. So preserving this heritage means staying put, staying close to the land. Palestinians are able to resist dispossession and cultural annihilation at the hands of settler colonialism. So now I want to zoom in on this heritage work. And I want to talk in particular about the work of RIWAQ and organizations that I have collaborated with, and that was the first Palestinian heritage organization to work to preserve the historic built environment. Palestinian heritage organizations have a very long history. They don't, begin, this history doesn't begin with 1991 when RIWAQ was founded. Actually, it begins at the beginning of the 20th century, but for now, I will focus on the Oslo and post-Oslo period, because it is then that those organizations were able to intervene in the built environment of Palestine that was so threatened by both colonization and urbanization. So I've argued that RIWAQ has transformed over the year in a kind of shadow ministry of culture and cultural heritage. And a few examples will help you demonstrate how RIWAQ has acted like a state in heritage, and though in distinctly inventive and collaborative ways. Using Swedish development funding and the help of hundreds of architecture students and professionals, over the years, RIWAQ has compiled the Registry of Historic Building in Palestine, published in 2006. The National Registry, as it is known, surveys over 550,000 Palestinian buildings in detail in the West Bank and Gaza. Rather unusually for a bureaucratic instrument, it is introduced by a poem. Of the properties listed, and this is an example of work that RIWAQ has done. This is, sorry, it's a village close to Al Khalil. It's an amazing village. Sorry, I have a moment of amnesia. Dahriya, yes, this is Dahriya that was also renovated. This was before the start of the renovation by RIWAQ. This is a photo of, I believe, 2008, and this is the Ottoman court in Ramallah. Thank you. Of the properties listed in the National Registry, RIWAQ prioritized what they saw as the 50 most significant and representative historic centers for rehabilitations in the years to follow. So in this way, they effectively drew up a national plan for heritage conservation. Of course, it was limited to the West Bank and only in a very limited ways to Gaza for obvious reasons of accessibility. So they could not work in 48. And this plan for heritage conservation is the 50 Villages project, which RIWAQ pushed through a variety of initiatives, including setting up a Palestinian biennial for art and architecture that continues until today, or it continued until the pandemic. So in the long-standing absence of a formal legal framework for the protection of the historic built environment and recent vernacular architecture, RIWAQ managed to have some protection cunningly introduced through the planning system. So arguably, in this way, through these master plans, through the National Registry, through the 50 Villages project, RIWAQ managed to conserve, to set up a national plan for heritage conservation in the West Bank, and in this way, it can be argued that it is carrying out key functions of the state in heritage in a context where the state does not exist. Now, I want to show you a couple of examples, because this is, I used the example of RIWAQ, particularly because I've worked a lot with them, and because of their particular practice that I will go back to in conclusion. But there are many similar and related projects. Another project that I know quite well is the rehabilitation project in the old city of Hebron. The old city of El Khalil is an amazing old city, but it has been partly occupied by settlers, very ideological, very violent settlers. And I would argue this is a map of the old city of Hebron with the settlements in light blue. And you can see and a large part of the old city of Hebron has been restored, renovated, and repopulated by the work of the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee, and which is effectively the only Palestinian institution which is active in the old city of Hebron, which is practically Area C, meaning completely controlled by the Israeli army and the settlers. So you see here how literally sort of by rehabilitating heritage organizations such as the HRC, the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee, and RIWAC have been able to stop the advance of the settlements. These are some of the pictures of the work of rehabilitation of RIWAC and other organizations in the West Bank. This is the Birzeit Old City Center. For those of you who have taught at Birzeit, it's a very familiar image with some of the activities. And then this is groups of students drawing and preparing the documentation of the historic building in the village of Frantis. And this is part of the 50 Villages project, which I remind you, it's about restoring the 50 most significant historic centers in the West Bank. What I want to emphasize in the work of RIAC is, and other organizations as well, is first of all the ways in which art is mobilized very often in these heritage projects in very resourceful and, in my view, effective ways. The 50 Villages project was launched in the context of the Venice Biennale. Which was in 2009. This was the year of the first Palestinian pavilion in the Venice Biennale, and RIWAC participated in the Venice Biennale through the 50 Villages project. So in a way, by enacting state work in heritage and performing it on an art stage. And through this performance, it has done quite a lot of fundraising and infrastructure building in order to push through the 50 Villages project. So here there are a couple of key features of this kind of practice. This is the performance by Khalil Rabah, artist who was at the time the artistic director of RIWAC, who performed heritage preservation on the Venice stage by inviting people in Venice to the inauguration of the 50 Villages project. So I want to highlight, before I conclude, a few key elements of this heritage practice. The alliance with arts and all kinds of creative practices, the multi-scalar, networked, and participatory way of working, which means mobilizing sort of multiple transnational and translocal platform to sort of get heritage work done, in this case, the Venice connection. And also, I would argue the mixing of a set of instrument of classic state bureaucracy, such as surveys, for example, with more, with a kind of practical knowledge. This is a term by James Scott, anthropologist James Scott, that refer to an acquired intelligence that comes from the capacity to understand and respond promptly to a changing environment in which in a human effective ways, often from a position of closeness, familiarity, and confidence. So in other words, I'm saying that REWAC brings together a very sort of translocal and yet deep knowledge of both of place in the West Bank, as well as with this very, very wide-ranging transnational connection to implement what I would argue a kind of elastic form of state work, which is consistent with local needs. I wanted to discuss also the example of the Khalil Sakakini Cultural Center and the ways in which it transformed itself once these NGOs entered a major crisis due to lack of funding and the Ford Foundation cutting funding to the Palestinian cultural and heritage sectors. The Sakakini decided to transform its way of working from an NGO into a kind of platform mobilizing multiple Palestinian actors and communities to invest and produce heritage with them. So instead of treating audiences as passive audiences, the Sakakini mobilized through a set of artistic intervention those audiences to produce content themselves, so to own the center. And this is, I think, another example of this kind of creative institutionalism that I'm talking about. Now, and something that, one final example, because before I come to my conclusion, do I still have 3 minutes? Okay. The last example that I want you to remind you of is the Palestinian art and culture and art and architecture biennials, which started through an initiative of REWAC and the gallery, the Mamal in the Jerusalem Old City Center, and slowly grew into a network of Palestinian cultural organizations which came together to organize Calandia International, which has been running between 2012 and 2018, which is actually very much akin a traditional national biennial, which is usually organized by a state infrastructure and by the cultural ministry. So in Palestine, it was not the PA Ministry of Culture, but it was this alliance of organizations that got together and produced this series of biennials. Now, what is there? I mean, I've been criticized for romanticizing what is a fundamental problem in terms of a lack of a functioning state infrastructure, the occupation, and also romanticizing certain grassroots initiatives. Yet, I want to stick to my point that I believe there is very much that we can learn from this model of institution building in Palestine. And I believe that also we should, if not completely leave aside, at least question this idea of the need for a strong functioning state infrastructure in order for heritage to thrive. Also because we know, and this was the first part of my talk, that state can be extremely destructive of heritage while saying that they are there to preserve. And I just wanted to, in conclusion, connect to some recent proposal for future states coming out of both critical theory and visionary policy circles, which share features with the Palestinian experiments I've described. These new ideas of the state, these features that Palestinian organizations share with new visions of the state and how it is transforming. So these features that are shared include the centrality of civil society, self-governing institutions, flexible forms of cooperative provision and co-creation, sealed off from bureaucratic or market interference, a recognition of the importance of lived experience and human relationship in government. It's usually called the relational state. So there is this trend in policy circles trying to push for, in a way, a post-state institutional infrastructure that guarantees sustainability while sort of without ossifying into a set of ultimately oppressive states infrastructure. So this might jettison clear predetermined visions of how the state should be in favor of embracing the creative, productive, and unforeseen qualities of processes of socio-institutional co-creation, whose outcomes cannot be determined in advance. Then, in place of a list of policy recommendations, in conclusion, I would like to make a plea for a non-Manichaean approach to post-conflict heritage reconstruction that is not grounded in assumed dichotomies, destruction, reconstruction, tangible, intangible, formality, informality, conflict, post-conflict, top-down, bottom-up, and also that is not grounded in a problematic understanding of both heritage expertise and what functioning heritage institutions are. Such approach might learn from Palestinian creative institutionalism. This is a fragmented, incomplete, and precarious endeavor, but nonetheless deeply resourceful and astute. It is participatory, networked, and multiscalar, connecting to multiple transnational ecosystems. Tapping into latent socio-material energies and multiscalar connections, creative institutionalism arguably fosters societal resilience. Sustaining and restoring cultural heritages, it presents an autonomous self-organizing besides and beyond the state. And it shows how civil society may offer concrete solutions on the ground while reimagining while doing the work more just state cultural functions in the context of state oppression or failure. And I thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you, Chiara. Maybe you need a glass of water after this interesting, fascinating talk. You've thrown many thought-provoking ideas, and I'm sure many people here, they have some questions. We have about, let's say, less than half an hour for questions, and then we're going to go for dinner. So whenever you have a question, please raise your hand and introduce yourself with your affiliation. That would be great. Taysir, could you, yeah, we have here Ghattas, Dr. Ghattas.
Hello. Thank you, Chiara. This is Gattas Saish from BZ, and I worked with most of the institutions, both NGOs and the governmental. And I totally agree with you. When I worked with the Department of Antiquities, one of the obstacles for constructions, of course, is the political reasons and the division of the West Bank between Area C and B and D, which I will talk about tomorrow. And the other reason, which actually I would still remember it, is the hatred between the leadership of the Department of Antiquities as well as the NGOs. And I worked with everyone, so I have talked to everyone. And this is unfortunately reality. And if we will ignore this part and we will go directly to the NGOs, the work that RIWAC has done is excellent. And the way, if I will take Birzeit as an example, the old village of Birzeit, they reconstruct the entire village and they use it as a cultural center. And you have festival each year, annual festival. And you have, it comes everyone with their traditional work, folklore, dancing, They use it as a market as well, which is sponsored by the municipality of Birzeit. And in this way, not only the inhabitants of Birzeit, but the inhabitants of the entire region, they come there annually, and there are thousands of people who are participating in these annual festivals. And here we are talking about local tourism, local income, and that's why it will succeed. And what Iraq is doing, they will basically take the entire buildings or rent it for free for 10 years or 15 years because they paid for everything. And afterwards, the landowners will take these properties again, and then they can do whatever they want. If we use the same principle in the rest of the world, in Syria, in Iraq, in other parts of the world, I guess we will succeed as well. Thank you.
If I can say something briefly, because this is something that I was doing the bulk of my field work. I did it in the West Bank and in Ramallah with Riwaq and in El Khalil with the Hebron Rehabilitation Committees in the years when the battle between sort of the state and the NGOs was raging around the law and sort of there was a very sort of the kalam nas, the discourse was that it was a matter of clash of personality. And everyone, I mean, I was working with the NGOs and everyone hated the head of the Department of Antiquities. I mean, I remember at the same time, I mean, my idea, and I remember I talk a lot about it with Salim and with Suad, my idea was that it's actually structural. Because in a way, Hamdan Taha was doing his work. Because, I mean, he was in a paradoxical, in a way, he was overperforming the state without having the power of the state. I mean, I remember him threatening NGOs and saying, you cannot just go work and restore this village. And people were saying, oh yeah, please come and stop me. You want to stop me? And, you know, and before the Israeli army or the settlers stops me. And so in a way, I think in a way, he was also, his sort of this clash in a way was very much structural. And I also remember very clearly Suad Amiri, the founder of Riwaq, saying, actually, we do want a strong state. But in fact, you know, he was trying to do the work of the state by regulating the heritage sector, again, without having the power. And also, I mean, I think he was wrong in the sense that, in my sort of humble opinion, he should have just facilitated NGOs' work. Because if you don't come up with a law that protects 90% of above ground Palestinian heritage quickly, you better let other people do that kind of emergency work. So in a way, I'm not one of those who, you know, very sort of one of the strong critics of Hamdan Taha, because I think in a way he was doing his work perhaps too literally as a defender of a state that was not there or that was multiple.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you to develop about the colonial approach of archaeologists. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's in short, essentially, the work of historians and anthropologists, political scientists, as demonstrated in so many ways that archaeology has functioned essentially as handmaiden to the colonial project in a place like in the MENA region and particularly in the Levant. Just to, first of all, there are multiple levels of my explanation. I'll just mention, let's say, 4, but sort of this argument should require a much more detailed treatment, which I do not have the time to do now. First of all, there is a matter of the narrative of the cradle of civilization. And I have to say, when I hear the word civilization, I I cannot but be reminded of the kind of colonial inflection of that particular narrative. Because one of the justifications of the colonial project was precisely to save the remains of the cradle of Western civilization, or the cradle of civilization understood as Western civilization, from what was perceived or discursively constructed as the natives' neglect and lack of care for heritage. There are plenty of studies of colonialism and the ideology of the civilizing mission that discuss and flesh out this narrative of it's European who must come to the region and save those ruins, because otherwise the natives will destroy them. And it's still very powerful today, arguably also in, for example, some parts of the global heritage discourse and some mobilization of the global heritage discourse. At the level of the practical level, I mean, in a way, all the, like, if you look at the biography of a lot of the archaeologists of the late 19th and early 20th century, they were very, very often colonial agents. Again, I've mentioned Gertrude Bell because that's probably the most obvious examples, but many other, Max Oppenheimer, Lawrence of Arabia, and they were very much part of the colonial elite and the implementation of colonial government. The role of archaeological surveys and of archaeologists and scholars in the making, for example, in the mapping and surveying of the MENA region, which has been very functional and very important to guarantee the maintenance of colonial control. The kind of sort of colonial relationship that I experienced myself still in the 90s on archaeological excavations, this emphasis on the pre-Islamic layers and the destruction and absolute neglect of, in most cases, of what came before. So all this, these are just a few examples of the ways in which essentially, and of course I haven't talked about, because this would require at least a lecture on its own, the role of biblical archaeology and archaeology in the Israeli national colonial, sort of settler colonial project in Israel, because it was fundamental. Also in terms, and is still fundamental today, in legitimizing a sense that Palestine belongs to the Jewish people because there are remains of what is said to be ancient Israelites there. But for that, again, I recommend you to read just one out of many publications, the work of Nadia Abu al-Hajj, Facts on the Ground. And her main argument is that archaeologists establish the facts on the ground of Israeli ownership of Palestine and colonial ownership and rights over the Levant in general. And again, I cannot do justice to such a complex and multifaceted topics in just a short answer, but I hope I've given you just a couple of good examples to grasp the topic.
عفوا
I forgot my Arabic, unfortunately.
سوف أتحدث باللغة العربية. طبعا سأعود إلى النقطة اللي أنا محمود هدية من دائرة الآثار الليبية ومختص في علم الآثار وأهتم كثيرا بمشاكل
Libyan directorate, I'm very much interested in the preservation of real estate, in particular heritage. So you talked about the problematic of non-governmental institutions and their relationship with governmental institutions and the protection of cultural heritage. So the difference that manifests amongst a number of Arab countries and what is happening in Libya in this regard. We talked previously about sometimes we attempt to preserve the heritage, but sometimes we distort it and perhaps contribute to its destruction. Particularly, this is carried out by non-governmental institutions that are not specialized in the protection of such heritage. So what is happening is the fact that the state is not aware of the importance of this tangible heritage, which is a kind of energy that cannot be revived. If we lose it, we cannot revive it, we cannot rebuild it once again. So that is why the support that governmental institutions receive in order to protect such heritage is very, very low, is not up to the responsibilities that the institutions should meet, particularly in conflict countries such as Syria, Iraq, or Libya, or other countries. Many of them, they use the pretext of paying heed to the livelihood of citizens and the requirements of the lives of citizens. So they concentrate on such components and but we think that this heritage is very important to humanity in general, and not only to the people where such heritage happens or is. So these institutions, as per the law, are the ones that should protect the heritage. It seems that these institutions do not communicate with the different institutions of the state. So from my perspective, I think that governmental institutions are only supportive institutions. They are not specialized. And before coming here, I was trying to promote the idea of working on the convening of a workshop or a conference of all these institutions together, to bring them together in order to establish a methodology whereby they would be able to cooperate and try to protect the heritage, because we do not want to lose this entity that supports us, because we as archaeologists to have an entity to support, because Libya, such a large country that has a large heritage, we cannot, we as archaeologists, work on our own in order to document and protect our heritage. We do require the support of the different entities, but at the same time, we need to consult with each other. We need to set a real methodology of cooperation. Thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا. لست متأكدا إذا ما فهمت
But
التفصيل.
what I'm not saying that we should abolish state infrastructure for heritage preservation. This is not what I'm saying. Indeed, along the lines of what you said, I believe that sort of the future and the reality is one of multiple partnership and alliances of different kinds of bodies. Particularly also because, and my argument was especially against this idea that we need a strong state heritage infrastructure in order to preserve and reconstruct, to preserve heritage. I'm not saying that I fully disagree with that. I'm only saying, first of all, that we tend to assume a model of heritage, state heritage preservation that has profound colonial origins everywhere. And I can also mention the contestations around Italy's management, heritage management, and sort of the struggle around it. And so I don't think, sort of in a way, going back, some of the argumentations that were aired in the debate in Italy were for, let's go back to the good old days of the welfare state, when we had a very strong Now I'm making the Italian case because it's kind of easy to summarize in the debate in a few sentences. But there has been a long debate in Italy in the last 20 years around the transformation of the state infrastructure for heritage preservation. And there is a very strong argument of colleagues that I highly admire for, in a way which is conservative, for going back to the old style, strong presence, to old style presence on the ground of a specific heritage infrastructure, which is in fact is of fascist origin in Italy. It was created by Mussolini. And so, I mean, while I believe that we must, of course, there must be rules, there must be an infrastructure, at the same time, I don't think that going back in time is the solution. All those systems of heritage preservation have very, in many cases, shady origins. They originate in the colonial period, or, for example, in Italy, in the fascist period. And I believe the future is indeed in the direction that you are mentioning of partnership, complex sort of networked partnership of between different actors, which recognize that heritage is essentially, this is one of the first things that I teach my students in heritage studies. Heritage is about disagreement, is a concept that was coined in the 90s called heritage dissonance, that we disagree. Heritage is about dissonance because we have different ideas about, you know, what counts as heritage, what to select, what to throw away, how to do that, and how to preserve it. And so I see kind of complex negotiations around the multiple meanings and the multiple uses of heritage by networks of partners and alliances like the Palestinian Biennial, probably declined in a more sort of sustainable, and because there is a problem of sustainability of networks, that's also the problem. That must be, in my view, not be dominated by commercial or other violent logics, because otherwise we are back into the cycle of human and non-human destruction. So please don't take my argument as either or. I want to abolish the state infrastructure, so the departments of antiquities, because it's of colonial origins. But this is something that we should recognize, because there is a clear continuity I would say probably overall in the MENA region, between the Department of Antiquities set up in the colonial period and the sort of post-independence Department of Antiquities, in terms of not only in terms of the infrastructure, but in terms of the law, the understanding of what counts as heritage, the specific practices, also the utter disregard for local community, as much as this concept is contested and means multiple things.
We have time for one.
Sorry, I'm
questions.
very long.
Yeah,
I'll try to be very short.
Yeah, okay. Aurora, then Eleanor, please.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Aurora from Amsterdam University.
Oh. We're colleagues.
Yes. I have a question because you mentioned the association of colonial nationalism with archaeological sites, obviously, and I agree with you, but
colonialism and post-colonial nationalisms.
Yes. But of course, there have also been many countless people in Libya and Iraq and Syria who have fought and died for this Roman or, well, often it was the Roman archaeological sites. And I wonder if we have to then understand these people as maybe accidental agents of colonialism, or can you find a more nuanced way of seeing this emotional entanglement?
I mean, I'm not saying that, I don't, I'm afraid that my argument has been misinterpreted. I'm not saying that those who care for sort of all archaeologists are today colonial agencies. That's really not what I'm saying. In that sense, I'm sort of, I refer you to two books that for me have been important. One is Elliot Collar's work on Egypt, Conflicted Antiquities. And the other one is actually the book is about something else, but there is a very interesting introduction of Desiring Arabs by Joseph Massad, which talks about the notion of civilization. And both of these books essentially talk about how anti-colonial nationalism unintentionally, to use sort of probably a term that is not fully appropriate, it doesn't sort of grasp the complexity of the phenomenon, but that I want to use for the sake of brevity. So that, you know, part of colonial discourse was unintentionally incorporated into anti-colonial nationalisms of different kinds. For example, in the cult of antiquities. If you think about, you know, the sort of the role of the pharaonic past in Egypt at the beginning, you know, in the 50s and still today, if you think about, you know, the procession of last year, the inauguration of the new museums by the pyramids. And again, it's just, they are all uses of archaeology for the reproduction of and reenactment of state powers. And this is a colonial legacy. So I hope this doesn't sound like I'm saying that all archaeologists are colonial agencies, because this is not the case. I mean, I myself, I mean, I always make some of my students, so in a way, I'm a university teacher, and I teach in an institution which has a profound colonial history, and I'm aware of that. And I hope that me trying to work within that university, which is also yours, trying to change it doesn't mean that I'm an agent of the persistent of colonialism in the present. I'm saying that kind of discourse of antiquities through multiple avenues, including the infrastructure of governance or the governance of antiquities, such as the various departments of antiquities, persisted in the narrative of anti-colonial nationalisms. And of course, it was also transformed, is not exactly the same. It's just that part of it's like threads of the narratives, and threads of those practices persisted. Sorry, I don't see very much the faces in the back because I have the lights in my face. So.
Hi there. My name's Eleanor. I'm from Deakin University in Australia, and I just had a brief question about whether you'd considered Palestinian refugees living in diaspora, because a lot of what you were saying about you know, this absence of a state and this sort of upsurge of grassroots efforts really reminded me of you know, the efforts to preserve Palestinian nationalism in diaspora, which also occurs without a state infrastructure, and yet, as we have seen, is you know, intergenerational and extremely strong to this day. So I was wondering if there was any sort of role, or if you'd considered yeah, the diaspora and looking at particularly intangible heritage, but also other forms of heritage that might be relevant there.
Absolutely. My own fieldwork is very much, was very much concentrated in the West Bank for more or less practical reasons, but I would say this kind of this kind of creative institutionalism actually is not sort of contained within the boundaries of Palestine, but in fact is profoundly diasporic. And I can mention plenty of similar and different institutions that reproduce some of those features. For example, the first thing that came to my mind while you were talking are the series of digital archives in Lebanon, in the camps with the and initiatives to digitalize the history of the camps, the photos, which are very often also done sort of by groups of artists or specific artists together with people from the refugee camps themselves. Now I'm thinking of for example, the project of Jasmine. Yeah, there are so many, but I was thinking of a number of those digital archival projects by diaspora artists working in collaboration with various refugee bodies and in the camps in Lebanon and beyond. So it's not at all constrained within the boundaries of Palestine, and actually sort of transnational, translocal connection are very much part of this of this creative institutionalism. I was just thinking a project that I've written about 2 months ago, and sorry, I'm also a bit tired. That was also shown at the Documenta in Kassel, an art show, which is also part of this tactic of magnifying the effects of projects by mobilizing transnational platform, high visibility transnational platforms like the international biennials. Is Jasmine a Palestinian artist? Okay, it will come to my mind probably during dinner. No.
Perhaps it can come after dinner.
Yes.
Maybe because
I
her
think
mind is
yes.
busy with the other Zoom meeting in 15 minutes. So thank you very much for the lecture. And it's really nice to end up with Palestine, because tomorrow we're going to start with Palestine in a session on Palestine's cultural heritage and colonial state politics, moderated by Dr. Isam Nassar, head of the history department here at the Doha Institute. And now I guess we need to invite you for the dinner that's going. I guess Zinat sent me some pictures. They prepared a very nice, lovely evening in the outside. The weather is really lovely, and I hope you will enjoy the dinner, and we'll see you tomorrow at 9. But before we leave, join me with a round of applause to Chiara.
Thank you for inviting me and for your question, very generous question, and let's continue the discussion over dinner.